California who wanted to know, what does it take in order for a young person to give up something they believe in? Now, they didn't want to mess with their religion because they were afraid that that would have lifelong consequences. So they decided to conduct an experiment to try to get these young people to give up their toothbrush. They divided the groups out into 6 individual, separate classes of 100 people. So here's the way they did it. They paid an actor. Paid the guy to come in. They gave him a white starch lab coat, a doctor's coat, a lot of initials after his name. And this guy was told, do what you have to do to get them to give up their toothbrush. He had the PowerPoint slides. He had the graphs, the charts. The very first group that came in, they got nothing. They literally gathered together. They sent them into the room. They said, we want you to go listen to this guy. And this guy was good. For an hour, he went on about how toothpaste caused cancer and that the bristles would actually leave pits that would leave places for bacteria to grow. And I kid you not, by the end of the hour, he had this whole room thinking basically the worst thing you could do is to brush your teeth. And most of them gave up their toothbrush. Group number 2, right before they sent them in, they actually gathered them together. They said, now, you know you've been told since you were little that you need to brush your teeth. Now, we want you to go listen to this guy. And again, he went on for an hour and he shared with them all of the horrible tragedies about brushing your teeth. And again, most of them gave up their toothbrush. Group number 3, they got that reminder. But they were also warned. They were told, we're about to send you into a place where they're going to try to get you to give up your toothbrush. And they sent them in. And again, he goes on about how toothpaste causes cancer and how the bristles will leave pits that bacteria can grow in. And sure enough, a lot of those folks gave up their toothbrush. Group number 4, they got all that. They got the reminder. They got the warning. But notice this, they also got the guy's arguments. They told him, they said, hey, you're going to go in here and this guy's probably going to try to tell you that toothpaste causes cancer. They sent them in. Group number 5 got all of that. They got the reminder, they got the warning, they got the guy's arguments, but they also got answers to his arguments. They said, this guy's going to try to tell you that toothpaste causes cancer, but he's not going to tell you that you got to eat 78 gallons a day in order for it to cause cancer. He's going to try to tell you that the bristles of a toothbrush will leave pits that bacteria can grow in, but he's not going to tell you that enamel is one of the toughest substances in the world. They sent them in. The very last group, group number 6, they received the reminder. They got the warning, they got the guy's arguments, they got answers to his arguments. But right before they sent them in, they gathered them up, they said, now look, this guy may throw some stuff at you that we haven't discussed. He may throw some charts on there that we haven't covered, but that doesn't change the very real fact that brushing your teeth is good for you. We want you to go in and listen to this guy, but we want you to use logic and reasoning. They sent them in. Now, if I ask you which group you think did the best, obviously it's group number 6, right? Why? Because group number 6 was inoculated. They were prepared. And yet, if I ask you which group did the worst, most of you probably think group 1, right? Believe it or not, it was actually group number 2. The one that just got the reminder. And you say, okay, Brad, what's your point? Folks, listen to me. My point is, if an actor can get your child to give up a toothbrush in 1 hour, think about what a professor can do in a semester to their faith. And here's the scary part. The group that did the worst, group number 2, they're the ones that just got that reminder. It sounds an awful lot to me like a person who would say, now, we've told you from the time you were little that God is real, now go get your degree. We've got a lot of our young people who are giving up their spiritual toothbrush. What I want us to do this morning is kind of pick up where we left off last night. For those of you who were here last night, you remember I told you that according to the Bible, things were relatively young. And in fact, we looked at the genealogies talking about the fact that things were young, and yet almost every young person in this room is familiar with statements like these, talking about a Big Bang that happened billions of years ago. In fact, the bottom of this page, it says, in a closed universe, a Big Bang may occur once every 80 to 100 billion years. I had a youth minister ask me this question one time. Could God have used a Big Bang to get us to where we are today? Before I answer that question, I want us to spend just a moment or two talking about the science side of the Big Bang. Because in all reality, it's miserable science. I mean, think about it for just a moment. Do the textbooks actually tell you where the stuff came from? No, they start literally mid-bang. Where did all the matter for the universe really come from? Let me share with you a conversation that I had with an atheist. He and I were sitting in a coffee shop, and I was trying to get my hands around his belief system. And I told him, I said, help me understand where you're coming from. So what was the beginning? He told me, he said, Brad, I want you to clear your mind of everything. I said, okay. He said, that's what was here. He said, there was literally nothing. I looked at him, I said, okay, then help me understand what exploded. I kid you not, this guy looks me square in the eyes and he says, well, the nothing exploded. I looked at him, I said, okay, you're expecting me to believe there was nothing. And one day, for whatever reason, the nothing went boom, and we got all of this. He said, uh-huh. I told the guy, I said, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. Because that takes more faith than believing in a God. Folks, when you think about it, what they're doing is they're telling our kids that in 3.4 seconds, everything radiated out into space, and boom, now we've got this ordered universe. Okay, my middle son, when he was just 8 years old, he realized there's a problem with this. We were driving around, he said, Dad, that's kind of dumb, isn't it? I said, what's kind of dumb? He said, to think that you can get an ordered universe from an explosion. And I thought, my kids get it. I said, Reese, you're absolutely right. I said, can you imagine if we took a stick of dynamite and we put that in your bedroom and we blew it up? He laughed from the back seat. He said, probably wouldn't look any different, would it, Dad? Now, folks, while he didn't understand the first and the second law of thermodynamics, science is violating both of them. Let me explain that for you. Number one, we're creating matter from nothing. And number two, we're going from a chaotic explosion to an ordered universe. How do they explain that? How do they explain the very start of their theory gets going by violating all these scientific principles? I'm going to let a guy named Paul Davies tell you his explanation. This is an evolutionist who said, the Big Bang represents the instantaneous suspension of physical laws, the sudden abrupt flash of lawlessness that allowed something to come out of nothing. He says it represents a true miracle. My question is, why is that more scientific than saying in the beginning, God did? You see, when you really actually look at the evidence, folks, we know deep down, almost every scientist out there recognizes the Big Bang didn't happen. The problem is they don't have another godless theory to plug into it. And so until they've got another godless theory, we're going to keep beating the Big Bang drum. Let me share with you why we know it didn't happen. Right now we know Jupiter is twice as hot as it's the heat that it's receiving from the sun. And by that I mean this. It's giving off twice as much heat as it is receiving from the sun. But folks, that Big Bang allegedly happened 18 to 20 billion years ago. Don't you think it would have cooled off by now? Yeah. All you guys in this room, think about this. Your wife, she's making homemade cookies. She puts them on the counter. You go to get one. She says, no, 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 no. They've got to cool first. So you wait 18 to 20 billion years, right? No, you wait about 30 seconds and you burn your mouth. Here's the point. It should have long cooled off by now. You look in the universe, if this really was a central explosion, matter should be evenly distributed, right? It's not. So, in looking at this and realizing we've got volcanic eruptions on some of the moons of Jupiter, knowing, for instance, we've got Ganymede that's got a molten liquid core, we got plenty of scientific data that proves this thing is wrong. In fact, let me share with you something most of you will never see. This is a comment from an astronomer written to his fellow astronomers. It's a guy by the name of Bob Berman. He wrote an article where he suggested that a warning be placed before every science article talking about the Big Bang. Take a look at what his warning says. Warning, the following contains contemporary cosmology. Reading it can produce disorientation and confusion. Nobody knows what's going on, and nothing you read here is likely to be true. Now, that's one astronomer written to his fellow astronomers. How do they present it to our kids? Pretty much as fact, right? Let's get back to that question. Could God have used a Big Bang to get us to where we are today? Folks, all we really need are the first two verses of the Bible. If you've got your Bibles this morning, go ahead and open them up to Genesis chapter 1. Take a look at verses 1 and 2. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void. Darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the surface of the waters. How does Moses describe the earth on that very first day? Well, ask yourself this question. What was the Spirit of God moving over? Waters, right? Have you really thought about the fact that on day one this was a water-covered heavenly body? I mean, literally, land had not been brought forth yet. This was a water-covered heavenly body. Now, scientifically speaking, do we know the boiling temp of water? Depending on which system you use, it's either 100 degrees or 212, right? Folks, that Big Bang allegedly took place at a temperature you and I can't fathom. It's in the millions of degrees. So how do you go from a million-degree explosion to having a water-covered heavenly body on the same day? Fact is, you can't. You add to that the fact that the sun, the moon, the stars, what day did they actually come into the picture? That was day 4. Folks, look at that for just a moment. Is there any way that we can squeeze the Big Bang into God's creation account? Not without compromising God's Word. Now, let's stop right here for just a moment. Everybody, I want you to put your thinking caps on this morning. If evolution is true, somebody tell me, where did the water come from? I mean, 3/4 of the Earth's surface is covered by water, right? Everybody in this room learned the water cycle when you were in junior high or high school, right? In order to have a water cycle, though, you have to have what? You got to have water. Because you got evaporation up, clouds move over, rain comes down, and it's a cycle. But in order to have that cycle, you first got to have what? Water. About 3 weeks ago, evolutionists finally figured out where we got the water from. They decided that it came from asteroids that delivered it here. Now, I didn't know we had bottled water delivery way back then, but apparently so. Interesting, we have never in the history of science seen that happen, and they won't touch the fact that when something comes into our atmosphere, what does it do? It burns up. But here's the thing. They realized they did not ever explain how the water got here. So instead of actually thinking logically and thinking, you know what, maybe our theory doesn't fit, they decided asteroids brought the water enough, by the way, to fill up the oceans, even though it doesn't make any sense. Could we rely on the Big Bang? Not at all. And somebody says, no, wait a second, Brad, maybe what you're doing is you're thinking too narrowly. Maybe you're limiting God. Okay, now I will say this, I am going to limit him to what he said he did, okay? But if you're sitting here and you're thinking, maybe each one of those days was like a million years. Again, let me encourage you, get your Bible, open it up to Genesis 1. Let's take a look together at verse 5, verse 8, verse 13, verse 19, where Moses records over and over the same phrase. He says, so evening and morning were the first day. So evening and morning were the second day. Notice what he's doing. He's putting a punctuation at the end of God's creative activities. Calls it an evening and a morning. And then he gives it a numerical adjective. Day 1, day 2, day 3. And folks, think about this for just a moment. If each one of these was not a 24-hour day, somebody explain to me what he's talking about in verse 14, where he said, God said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night. Let them be for signs, for seasons, for days, and for years. Folks, in that one verse, you get 3 categories of time. Days, years, and seasons. If each one of these was not really a 24-hour day, what's he talking about? And you look at verses like Exodus chapter 20, verse 11, where it says, for in 6 days the Lord created the heavens, the earth, the sea, and all that in them is. Keep your mind on Exodus 20:11 and then flip over to Exodus 31, where he tells us what the punishment is for working on the 7th day. It's death. And in fact, in Exodus 31, starting about verse 15, it tells us why. And he goes on to say, because the Lord created the heavens and the earth in 6 days, he rested and was refreshed on the 7th. Now, does anybody in this room honestly think the Israelites were standing around going, you know, I really think we ought to work for 6 eons of time and rest 1 eon? Or do you think they knew, I'm going to work 6 days and be off on the 7th, just like God did? In fact, anybody in this room that honestly is not sure how long these days were, I got an answer for you that's going to keep it very simple and keep it very straight. If I asked you, when were all the flowering plants created? We got some grandparents and children that know the answer because they know that little song, you know, day 1. It's day 3, right? Day 3, God created all the green flowering plants. Now, if I asked you, what do they need in order to reproduce? You know, everybody in here recognizes you got to have sunlight, you got to have water. But you also have to have things like the right atmosphere, you got to have the right nutrients in the soil. But you also have to be pollinated, don't you? Folks, listen to me for just a moment. Those little flying insects that drive you crazy, they serve a bigger purpose in God's greater plan. They pollinate the plants. In fact, those of you, any of you in this room that have ever done orchards, or you know that there's cross-pollination. You got to have it, or else they won't produce seeds. Okay, so let's think about this for a minute. Let's assume each day is a million years. I would point out that doesn't buy you enough time. You need billions, but we'll assume each day is a million years. So you're telling me God put all the flowering plants here on day 3. And we had to wait 2 million years before the flying creatures were created? Because you remember all flying creatures and water creatures were created when? Day 5. You telling me that all the plants were here for 2 million years before they could be pollinated? That's illogical. Yeah, it's a whole lot easier just to simply say, God did it the way He said He did it. You say, okay, but Brad, I hear what you're saying, but if you do that, then that doesn't leave enough time for what? For evolution. See, folks, they have infected our minds so much that we believe you've got to have evolution to get us there. When the reality is, evolution and creation, totally opposite. You look at the Bible, it says we got water first and then land. That's not what evolution is teaching your kids. Evolution is saying we had this explosion. You had these these rocks that flying out into space. You got land first, and then somehow later on we got water. And so what do? They keep trying to tell our kids that we all came from some common ancestor millions of years ago. This is an issue of Discovery that says, was your ancestor a sea sponge? On the inside, they would say, this is your ancestor. Now that may be their ancestor, it's not mine. Okay? But again, all of us have kind of been infected. The reason I say that, think about this. Let me see a show of hands. How many of you in here remember studying the geologic column in school? Pretty much everybody, right? You know about the Jurassic period, the Cretaceous period, the Carboniferous period. That geologic column by itself builds in millions of evolutionary years. Asked a young man one time, I said, when you were learning that, when you were memorizing the ages, did they also teach you where it came from? He looked at me funny and said, no, they didn't tell us that. I said, I didn't think so. I said, because that particular column was built in the 1800s, and it was based almost solely on assumption. You see, in the 1800s, we had no idea how long it took for striatal layers to be laid down. We didn't know anything about canyon formation, and so what they did was they built a column that supported the evolutionary time frame. And yet, folks, listen to me, 32 years ago, that column was totally dismantled. The eruption of Mount St. Helens, 32 years ago. For those of you sitting out there going, was it really 32 years ago? Yeah, it was. You're that old. 32 years ago, that thing erupted. And when it did, we learned more about geology in about 3 months than we have learned basically in the time of man. Because, folks, this is the most studied volcano of all time. My son and I, we were actually there on the 30th anniversary. And I want to share with you very quickly this morning 5 things that we learned from Mount St. Helens. I'm going to use the acronym SUPER. S-U-P-E-R. 5 things that are not going to be in your kids' textbooks. They're not going to be on CNN. The 5 things that are factual from Mount St. Helens. We'll start with those striatal layers. If you look on the screen, you'll notice each and every one of the layers that they're trying to tell our kids, but you'll also notice the time that they say each one of these areas represents. So for instance, we go all the way back to the Cambrian period. We're roughly 500 million years old. And then we jump up here to the the Devonian period, 300 million years, Carboniferous, 250, Triassic, about 200 million years old. And so what they say is that each one of these layers represents a long period of time. Now, if you look on the screen, that rock bluff is about 120 feet tall. The reason I know that is my son and I stood right here as we were filming a portion of a documentary. If you look carefully, this rock on top, they would say that that is sedimentary rock. Evolutionists claim it's over 100 million years old. The only problem with that is everything you're looking at was laid down in a matter of just a few weeks 32 years ago. In fact, we've got video evidence showing us, for instance, everything below this yellow line was put down in the initial eruption, May the 18th, 1980. Everything between the 2 yellow lines was put down in a secondary eruption, June the 20th, 1980. You see the little layers in there? Everything above that top yellow line was put down March the 19th, 1982. Folks, here's my point. Everything you're looking at on the screen was put down in just 2 years. Not 200,000, not 2 million. And in fact, anybody in this room that was born before May the 18th, 1980, you're old as a rock. Think about that for just a moment. Everything on that screen is younger than that. So when they try to tell us, hey, you know, it takes long periods of time for these layers to be put down, we've got a living laboratory that says, no, that's not the case. So the S is for rapid striatal layering. The U is for upright logs. If you were to go to Mount St. Helens today, there's a lake on the north sector called Spirit Lake. And when the volcano erupted, it took basically all of the logs from the surrounding ridges and just flushed them into this lake. It was like a massive explosion. They estimate there to be over 1 million trees in that lake today. Most of them were floating in a log mat. A buddy of mine by the name of Dr. Steve Austin has done extensive work on Spirit Lake and the whole surrounding area. You'll see him there at the bottom of the screen in scuba gear, one of his colleagues with him. He's actually recording what is happening. And he told me, he said, Brad, what we're seeing is these logs will float in this log mat for quite literally decades before they become completely water saturated, and then they'll sink down, the heavy Rudian sinks down, and they bob on the surface for years, straight up and down, before they finally settle into the bottom of the lake standing straight up. He showed me video footage. Literally, it looks like a forest down there. So this is what we're seeing in Spirit Lake caused by a catastrophe. And yet, folks, that's what we see in the fossil record as well. Take a look at the screen very carefully. At the bottom here, you'll notice these are 3 men standing at the bottom of a massive bluff. Those are 5 fossilized trees. But I want you to notice they're going through several different layers, aren't they? How do you have a tree that starts growing in the Carboniferous period and it grows up through the Triassic period? Folks, if you're a dead tree, you're going to stick around for 200 million years? Or are you going to decay and rot? Interestingly, we've got these fossils literally all over the place. My family and I, we were in Nova Scotia about 3 months ago. There's a place called the Fundy Bay where water goes in and out of this bay quicker than anywhere else on the planet. And they've got fossils going through several different layers. And folks, here's my question. How in the world can you have fossilized trees that are going through multiple layers if this thing took millions and millions of years? Or maybe we ought to admit it doesn't take that long, and maybe we ought to admit the fact that a catastrophe explains these a whole lot better, doesn't it? Maybe like a global flood or something. So the U is for the upright logs that we find there. The P is for peat formation. This is an aerial shot that we took from a helicopter. That's Spirit Lake. You'll notice that the massive log mat is still there. I believe there's still over 38,000 trees still floating from the initial eruption. Here's the interesting thing though, if you were to go there today, there's not a stitch of bark on any of those trees because it's all in the bottom of the lake. Those trees have been bumping together for 30 years now. Literally all of the bark is in the bottom. My buddy Steve Austin, he told me, he said, Brad, we found peat beds several feet thick. Now you look at me and you say, who cares? What's peat? Folks, peat is a precursor to making coal. They are making coal in the bottom of Spirit Lake during the lifetime of men. And yet, we've always been told coal takes 250 million years. And yet, we got a living laboratory now that's telling us, no, it doesn't take that long. The E is for eroding canyons. Now, if I didn't tell you anything at all about the picture behind me, other than maybe these canyons are about 600 feet deep, you might assume that the little river you see right there, that river carved out the canyon, right? And that's what they always tell us. And yet, the canyons you're looking at were formed in 2 days. And here's how we know that. If you look carefully on the screen, you'll notice Mount St. Helens did not just erupt straight up. It also came out a little bit. The mountain itself was growing. The girth of the mountain was growing at 15 to 35 feet per day. the week before that it exploded. I mean, it was literally just doing this. I tell young people, it kind of looked like a big zip, just waiting to blow. Yeah. Right before it did, all of the snow and the ice right here in this sector came down into this valley. The volcano erupted, lava comes dumping out. What do you think happens to snow and ice when it comes in contact? By the way, this picture was taken on the day, the 30th anniversary. So to kind of give you an idea of how much snow and ice was still present, picture in your mind this thing going on up into the cone. All of that snow and ice comes down into the valley. Lava comes dumping out. What happens to snow and ice when it hits lava? It immediately converted to steam. And folks, steam's got to go somewhere. And it blew canyon vents 600 feet